So now we're going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience of motivation. And this is really important because when we think about motivation, we oftentimes confuse it with things like discipline and control and willpower. So when we think about discipline and control, it's kind of forcing yourself to do something. But the truth is, if you look at motivation, motivation is an intrinsic desire to do something. You don't have to force yourself to do anything. And as we tunnel down into the neuroscience of it, we'll start to see that different parts of the brain are responsible for creating that intrinsic motivation. And that you actually don't need to force yourself to do anything if you understand these parts of the brain. As we go through these parts of the brain and we start to understand how each of these contributes, we'll also lay the foundation for problems with motivation. Because each of these parts of the brain, if it's not functioning properly, is going to create some kind of obstacle for us being motivated. Once we understand how the system works, we'll also be developing a roadmap for fixing motivational problems. Let's take a quick look at these different aspects of motivation and where they map to the brain. So the first is our hedonic circuitry is in the orbitofrontal cortex and governed by GABA and opioid neurotransmitters. The next part is our reward circuitry, which is governed by dopamine and is also found in the nucleus accumbens, and the primary circuit is the mesolimbic circuit. The next thing that we're going to talk about is effort computation, which is in the orbitofrontal cortex. There isn't a discrete neurotransmitter that's kind of involved there, but that's the part of our brain where we start to make computations about whether something is worth it or not worth it. And lastly, we have the emotional circuits of the brain, which are going to govern behavior as well. Also, there isn't a primary neurotransmitter here, but these are the parts of the brain that include the limbic system, which is kind of our emotional circuitry in the brain, as well as places like the amygdala. And what we'll see is that these things will connect to and influence all of the others. So the first part of the brain, or the first circuit that we're going to talk about, is the hedonic circuit. The hedonic circuit is usually found, or not usually, always in all human beings, is found in the orbitofrontal cortex. And the hedonic circuit is our circuit of liking things. So if we think a little bit about enjoyment, so enjoyment is a function that happens somewhere in the brain and happens in the orbitofrontal cortex. The primary neurotransmitters for hedonics are actually GABA and opioids. And so if we think a little bit about like substances of abuse, alcohol and opioids will make people enjoy things more. It's not really about, reward and fulfillment and things like that. It's just like straight enjoyment. So where we like and enjoy things in the brain is actually in the hedonic circuit. This is an important distinction because most of the time when people think about reward and they think about enjoyment, we focus on dopamine, which is also another really important circuit in the brain. So the nucleus accumbens, which is an important part of something called the mesolimbic circuit, is our reward circuit and is primarily the circuit that people talk about when they talk about dopamine. So the main neurotransmitter in the mesolimbic circuit is also dopamine. And this is the part of the brain that has to do with reward. So basically what the nucleus accumbens does is it connects a couple of key things that are involved in motivation. So the first is we'll have a behavior. And once we engage in the behavior, we'll get a reward. And once we get that reward, we'll learn something from it, right? We'll reinforce that original behavior. So if I eat something like a piece of cake and it tastes good, and then that gets reinforced, and then I want cake again, that's all governed through our dopaminergic circuitry, which is also known as our mesolimbic circuitry, and anatomically is in the nucleus accumbens. I know that the terminology can be a little bit overwhelming, but we'll go into more detail and you'll see why this is important down the road. So we have our hedonic circuitry, which is liking. We have our dopamine circuitry, which is reward circuitry. And the third part of the brain that involves motivation is actually our orbitofrontal cortex again, but this time we're going to be focusing on something called an effort computation. So our brain constantly makes computations about whether something is a good idea to do or not a good idea to do. And so if we think about the term motivation, what is it? It's kind of like this idea of, okay, should I do this or should I not do this thing? Is my brain telling me to engage in this behavior or not? And that has to do with something called an effort computation. So in a broad sense, if we think about behaviors that we engage in, they're behaviors that are kind of like high risk, high reward, or high effort, high reward, and low effort, low reward. Or they're behaviors that are low effort, high reward, or behaviors that are high effort, low reward. And as you can see, if we think about something that takes a lot of work but doesn't really give you much, we're not going to be engaged in motivating towards that behavior, right? We're going to want to do the most efficient things. And so there's a part of our brain that actually calculates efficiency. That part of our brain is our orbitofrontal cortex, and we call that the effort computation. As we'll move forward, we'll start to dig into how to manipulate that part of our brain so that we can naturally and intrinsically motivate ourselves towards particular behaviors. The next thing that we're going to touch on is just the emotional connection to motivation. So there are parts of our brain like the limbic system or the amygdala in which we experience emotions. And the cool thing is that emotions are really, really powerful drivers of behavior. So if we think about, applying for a job or going into interview, as we experience negative emotions, we sometimes want to pull back from that. So emotions can be really, really powerful drivers to kind of reduce our motivation or actually motivate us to stay home. So why is this important? It's because as we start to unpack motivation, we're going to need to understand each of these components of the brain. And the reason for that is that if we look at the problems in motivation, what we begin to see is that the problems of motivation arise from these different components. So let's just go through a couple of simple examples. So sometimes when you do something, it feels really good and you actually had a really great time. But you wake up the next day and you don't want to do it. If you can get yourself out the door and actually socialize with people, you're like, wow, that was a really great idea. I should do that more often. And if we think about people who struggle with motivation, how often do they say to themselves, I should really do that more often? And if we think a little bit about that, why do we make that statement? Why is it that we can enjoy something, really appreciate doing it, and not be motivated for it? That comes down to this connection between our hedonic circuit and our reward circuit, right? So liking and wanting are actually two different things. There are also a couple of other really important things to understand about these circuits, because sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where we cannot do things that are really, really good for us and really, really hard for us. We know we really need to, but the effort is high and the reward is high, and we can't really engage in those behaviors. What we find ourselves doing is being able to only engage in low effort, low reward behaviors or low effort, high reward behaviors. So we can't bring ourselves to study for a test that is in 3 months, even though that test is worth 90% of our grade. It takes a lot of work and it's absolutely going to be worth it, but I can't really bring myself to do it. And that comes to problems in this effort computation part of our brain. So as we understand these different kinds of circuits, as we understand the effect of emotions on our behavior, as we understand how to engage in high effort, high reward behaviors, as we understand the difference between liking and wanting, we'll start to understand motivation. And by understanding motivation, we'll gain control over it.